So, how does it feel to mop the floors at your husband's company? My son-in-law said in front of everyone at the BBQ. His father instantly froze. I wiped my hands on a napkin and calmly said, "Actually, I'm the CEO." He smirked and replied, "Yeah, I bet." Then his father stood up and shouted, "Boy, apologize now!" Because he knew exactly who I was. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Viola, and at 66 years old, I thought I had experienced every kind of family disappointment possible. I was wrong. The backyard barbecue was supposed to be a simple family gathering. My daughter Rebecca had invited everyone to celebrate her husband Sterling's recent promotion at work. The smell of grilled burgers filled the afternoon air as relatives chatted around picnic tables decorated with red checkered tablecloths. Children ran around the yard while adults sipped cold beer and lemonade. I wore my favorite blue sundress, the one Rebecca always said brought out my eyes. I had spent the morning preparing my famous potato salad, the same recipe that had been a hit at every family gathering for the past 20 years. Walking through the crowd with the large bowl in my hands, I felt genuinely happy to see everyone together. "Viola, there you are," called my sister-in-law Martha, waving me over to where she sat with several other family members. "We were just talking about how hard everyone's been working lately." I set the potato salad on the long buffet table and joined their conversation. Sterling was holding court, as usual, regaling everyone with stories about his new position as regional sales manager. His voice carried that familiar tone of self-importance that I had grown accustomed to over the past 8 years of his marriage to my daughter. "The responsibility is enormous," he was saying, gesturing with his beer bottle. "I'm overseeing 12 different accounts now. The company really recognizes talent when they see it." I smiled politely and nodded, though something about his bragging always made me uncomfortable. Rebecca beamed at her husband with obvious pride, and I was genuinely happy for her happiness, even if Sterling himself left me feeling cold. "Mom, come sit with us," Rebecca called out, patting an empty chair beside her. Sterling was just telling everyone about his promotion. I settled into the plastic chair, smoothing my dress. The conversation continued around me, mostly centered on Sterling's achievements and future plans. I listened quietly, occasionally commenting when spoken to directly, but mostly content to observe my family enjoying themselves. That's when Martha, perhaps trying to include me in the conversation, made an innocent comment that would change everything. "Viola works so hard too," she said with a warm smile. "Still putting in those long hours at 66. You're an inspiration to all of us working women." Sterling's head turned toward me, and I saw something flicker in his eyes. A familiar look that I had seen many times before but had always chosen to ignore. It was the look of someone who believed they were fundamentally superior to everyone around them. "Oh, right," he said, his voice taking on a tone that made my stomach tighten. "Viola works at Harold's company, doesn't she?" Harold was Sterling's father, a dedicated employee who had worked his way up to floor supervisor over the past 15 years. He was sitting just a few chairs away, and I noticed him stiffen slightly at the mention of his workplace. "Yes," I replied simply, not elaborating. I had learned long ago that sometimes the less said, the better. Sterling leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. The conversation around us had quieted, and I felt the uncomfortable sensation of becoming the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. "So, Viola," Sterling continued, his voice carrying just loud enough for everyone nearby to hear, "how does it feel to mop the floors at your husband's company?" The words hit me like a physical blow, the casual cruelty of it, delivered with such confidence in front of my entire family, took my breath away. Around us, conversations stopped entirely. I felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, some curious, others uncomfortable, a few clearly embarrassed by Sterling's rudeness. I looked at my daughter, hoping to see some sign of disapproval, some indication that she would defend me. Instead, Rebecca looked down at her hands, her cheeks flushed with what I realized was not anger at her husband, but embarrassment about me. Harold, Sterling's father, had gone completely pale. His beer bottle trembled slightly in his hands, and he was staring at his son with an expression of pure horror. But Sterling, oblivious to his father's reaction, was clearly enjoying himself. "I mean," Sterling continued, warming to his theme, "it must be tough at your age, getting down on your hands and knees to scrub floors, especially when you're working for the father of your daughter's husband. Talk about keeping it in the family, right?" A few people laughed nervously. Others looked away, clearly uncomfortable but not willing to intervene. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever, though it probably only lasted a few seconds. I reached for my napkin and wiped my hands slowly, giving myself time to think. My heart was pounding, not from fear or sadness, but from something else entirely, something that had been building inside me for years, waiting for exactly this moment. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm and steady. "Actually, Sterling, I'm the CEO." The smirk on his face widened. He actually laughed out loud, a sound so condescending that several people visibly cringed. "Yeah, right," he said, shaking his head with amusement. "I bet you are. CEO of the mop bucket division?" That's when Harold stood up so abruptly that his chair fell backward, clattering against the concrete patio. His face had gone from pale to bright red, and his eyes were wide with panic. "Boy, apologize now," he shouted, his voice carrying across the entire backyard. Everyone froze. Harold was known as a quiet, gentle man who never raised his voice. Seeing him like this was shocking enough, but the raw fear in his tone made it clear that something much bigger was happening. Sterling blinked, confused by his father's reaction. "Dad, what are you—" "Now!" Harold's voice cracked like a whip. "Apologize to her right now, before you destroy everything." The entire party had gone silent. Even the children had stopped playing, sensing the tension in the air. Sterling looked around at all the faces staring at him, his confidence beginning to waver for the first time. I remained seated, my hands folded calmly in my lap, watching this scene unfold. Inside, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness. Vindication, because finally, someone understood the gravity of what had just happened. Sadness, because it had taken this long for the truth to matter. Harold was breathing heavily, looking back and forth between his son and me with the expression of a man watching a disaster unfold in slow motion. And in that moment, I realized that tomorrow, when Sterling walked into work, his entire world was about to change in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. The question was, what was I going to do about it? Driving home from that disastrous barbecue, my hands gripped the steering wheel as Harold's panicked voice echoed in my mind. "Before you destroy everything." Those words carried more weight than anyone at that party could possibly understand. I pulled into my modest driveway, the same two-bedroom house I had lived in for 37 years. From the outside, nothing about my life suggested power or wealth. The lawn needed mowing, the shutters could use a fresh coat of paint, and my 10-year-old Honda sat next to the mailbox that still read simply, V. Martinez. This was exactly how I wanted it. Sitting in my living room that evening, surrounded by furniture I had bought decades ago, I couldn't help but think about how this perception had formed. It started innocently enough, back when Rebecca was in high school, and I was working 16-hour days to build something from nothing. 23 years ago, I had been exactly what Sterling assumed I was today, a cleaning woman. I scrubbed floors at Morrison Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company, working the night shift so I could be home when Rebecca got out of school. The pay was terrible, barely enough to cover our rent and groceries, but it was honest work and it kept us afloat after my divorce. What Sterling didn't know, what my own daughter didn't fully understand, was that I had used those nights to study. While I cleaned executive offices, I read every document left on every desk, financial reports, strategic plans, vendor contracts, personnel files. I absorbed everything like a sponge, teaching myself business from the ground up. The executives would arrive in the morning to find their offices spotless and their confidential documents exactly where they had left them. They never suspected that their cleaning woman had memorized their quarterly projections and identified the inefficiencies that were bleeding the company dry. It took me 3 years to work up the courage to write that first anonymous memo. I slipped it under the CEO's door on a Tuesday night, suggesting a simple change to the procurement process that would save them $200,000 annually. When they implemented it and saw the results, I wrote another one, then another. By the time someone in management started calling me the ghost advisor, I had already identified myself and pitched my ideas directly. They were so impressed that they offered me a position in their operations department. I accepted, but I kept my cleaning job too, at least for appearances. Rebecca was a senior in high school then, and I didn't want her to worry about money during such an important year. So I let her believe I was still just the cleaning lady, working extra shifts to save for her college tuition. It was easier than explaining that I was slowly becoming indispensable to Morrison Industries. When Rebecca left for college, I finally quit cleaning and threw myself completely into my new career. Within 2 years, I was promoted to operations manager. Within 5 years, I was vice president. The CEO, Harold Morrison, relied on me for everything. When he had his heart attack at 59, he begged me to take over as interim CEO while he recovered. He never recovered. And when the board offered me the permanent position, I accepted with the condition that we keep my appointment quiet. I didn't want the attention, the scrutiny, or the complications that came with being a female CEO in a male-dominated industry. I preferred to lead from the shadows. That was 18 years ago. Since then, Morrison Industries had grown from a struggling mid-sized company to a regional powerhouse with 1,200 employees and annual revenues of $340 million. We had expanded into 3 states, acquired 7 smaller companies, and built a reputation for innovation and reliability that our competitors envied. Through it all, I maintained my modest lifestyle. I drove the same car, lived in the same house, shopped at the same grocery store. When people asked what I did for work, I simply said I worked at Morrison Industries. When they assumed I was in a support role, I didn't correct them. Rebecca was so busy with her own life that she never questioned the details. She knew I worked at a company. She knew I could afford to help with her wedding and occasionally slip her a few $100s when money was tight, but she never asked for specifics. I think she assumed I had worked my way up to some kind of administrative assistant position. When Rebecca married Sterling 8 years ago, I met his father Harold at the wedding. Harold Turner was one of our most reliable floor supervisors, a man I respected for his work ethic and integrity. He recognized me immediately, of course, but when he started to introduce me to his family as his boss, I quietly asked him to keep that information private. Family dynamics can be complicated, I told him. Sometimes it's better to keep work and personal life separate. Harold understood. He was a wise man who had seen enough office politics to know that mixing family and business could create problems. So when Sterling made comments about his mother-in-law working at his father's company, Harold simply went along with the assumption rather than explaining the truth. Over the years, I watched Sterling develop into exactly the kind of person I had spent my career learning to manage. Arrogant, entitled, and convinced that his position made him superior to everyone around him. He treated service workers poorly, talked down to people he considered beneath him, and seemed to believe that his regional sales manager title gave him some kind of special status. I also watched my daughter fall deeper under his influence. Rebecca, who had once been proud of my work ethic and independence, began making little comments that stung more than I expected. Comments about how some people were content with simple jobs, how she was grateful Sterling was ambitious enough to support them both, how she hoped any future children would inherit their father's drive rather than settling for less. Each comment was like a small cut, but I told myself it didn't matter. I had built something remarkable, something that would outlast all of us. I had provided jobs for over 1,000 people, including Harold Turner. I had created value and prosperity in our community. What did it matter if my own daughter didn't understand? But sitting in my living room after Sterling's public humiliation, I finally admitted to myself that it did matter. It mattered that my daughter was embarrassed by me. It mattered that my son-in-law felt comfortable mocking me in front of our entire family. It mattered that I had spent so many years hiding my accomplishments that even the people closest to me had forgotten I was capable of greatness. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow, Sterling would walk into Morrison Industries for another day of managing his 12 accounts, reporting to his district manager, attending his meetings, and feeling important in his small corner of my company. Tomorrow, Sterling would learn exactly who he had been mocking all these years. The question that kept me awake that night wasn't whether I would reveal the truth. That decision had been made the moment he asked me how it felt to mop floors. The question was how much truth I was ready to share, and what I was willing to sacrifice to make sure Sterling understood the magnitude of his mistake. Because some lessons I had learned could only be taught once. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. I dressed carefully in my navy blue suit, the one I reserved for important board meetings, and drove to Morrison Industries with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The building stood 8 stories tall, all glass and steel, with Morrison Industries etched in elegant letters across the front entrance. As I walked through the lobby, nodding to the security guard who had greeted me by name for the past decade, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders. Today, that weight felt different. Today, it felt like power. My office occupied the entire northeast corner of the 8th floor, with windows overlooking the city and a conference table that seated 12. The mahogany desk had been Harold Morrison's, and I had kept it as a reminder of how far we had both come. On the wall behind my chair hung my MBA from Northwestern, earned through night classes over 6 grueling years, and below it, a photo of me shaking hands with the governor when we were named Regional Employer of the Year. I settled into my chair and opened my computer, pulling up the organizational chart for our sales division. Sterling Turner, Regional Sales Manager, Level 3. 12 accounts, as he had proudly announced at the barbecue. Annual salary of $87,000, plus bonuses that last year had totaled nearly $20,000 more. A comfortable living, especially for someone who had been promoted ahead of more qualified candidates 3 different times. I picked up my phone and dialed extension 4472. Jennifer, good morning. Could you please pull Sterling Turner's performance reviews for the past 18 months? I'll need them by 10 o'clock. Jennifer Walsh, my assistant for the past 8 years, never questioned my requests. Of course, Ms. Martinez. Should I also pull his sales reports? Yes, and his expense accounts. Everything. 20 minutes later, Jennifer knocked on my door and entered with a thick folder. Sterling Turner's complete file, she said, setting it on my desk. Is there something specific you're looking for? I opened the folder and began scanning the documents. Just a routine review. Thank you, Jennifer. What I found wasn't surprising, but it was disappointing. Sterling's performance reviews were consistently mediocre, padded with praise that seemed designed to justify his continued employment rather than reflect actual achievement. His sales numbers were adequate but unremarkable, falling in the bottom third of our regional managers. His expense reports showed a pattern of inflated charges for client dinners at expensive restaurants, weekend golf outings that somehow qualified as business development, and hotel stays that seemed excessive for routine sales calls. More telling were the notes from his direct supervisor, Michael Chen, a man I respected for his honesty and attention to detail. Buried in the carefully diplomatic language of corporate communication, I could read between the lines. Sterling was coasting, doing just enough to avoid criticism while taking credit for team successes and blaming market conditions for his failures. The promotion he had been celebrating at the barbecue? It had come with a salary increase of $12,000 annually, despite performance that barely justified his current position. I closed the file and sat back in my chair, considering my options. I had spent decades in corporate leadership, and I understood the delicate balance between personal feelings and professional responsibility. What Sterling had done to me was deeply personal, but what I was contemplating now had to be purely professional. Fortunately, the facts made that easy. I picked up my phone again. Jennifer, please ask Michael Chen to come see me when he has a moment. Michael appeared in my doorway 15 minutes later. a slight frown creasing his forehead. At 43, he was one of our most effective managers, the kind of person who could deliver bad news with empathy while still holding people accountable. "Good morning, Viola. Jennifer said you wanted to see me. Please sit down." I gestured to one of the chairs across from my desk. "I've been reviewing performance data for the sales division, and I have some concerns about Sterling Turner." Michael's expression didn't change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Relief, perhaps, or validation. "What kind of concerns?" he asked carefully. I opened Sterling's file and turned it so Michael could see the sales reports. His numbers have been declining for 6 consecutive quarters. His client retention rate is 12% below division average, and his expense-to-revenue ratio is the highest in the region. "Yes," Michael said slowly. "I've been documenting those issues in his reviews, yet he was promoted last month." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That decision came from above my level. I was told that Sterling had shown leadership potential and that the promotion was part of a long-term development strategy. I nodded, understanding exactly what had happened. Someone higher in the chain of command had overruled Michael's assessment, probably based on Sterling's ability to talk a good game rather than his actual results. It happened more often than I liked in corporate America, but it wasn't going to happen anymore. Not in my company. "I want you to put Sterling on a performance improvement plan," I said. 90 days, with specific, measurable goals. If he meets them, he keeps his position. If he doesn't, we'll need to consider other options. Michael leaned forward slightly. "What kind of goals?" I had given this considerable thought during my drive to work. First, he needs to increase his sales by 15% over the next quarter. That's aggressive but achievable for someone at his level. Second, he needs to improve his client retention rate to match division average. Third, he needs to reduce his expenses by 20% while maintaining the same level of client contact. "Those are significant improvements," Michael observed. "They're the kind of improvements we should expect from someone earning his salary and holding his title," I replied. "If Sterling truly has the leadership potential that justified his promotion, this should be a challenge he welcomes." Michael was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "I'll draft the improvement plan today. When should I present it to him?" "This afternoon." "And Michael?" I looked at him directly. "I want you to document everything. Every conversation, every deadline, every result. This needs to be handled by the book." After Michael left, I sat alone in my office looking out at the city below. I wasn't being vindictive. Every goal I had set for Sterling was reasonable and achievable. They were simply the standards that should have been applied to him all along. The truth was, I was giving him an opportunity that many executives in his position never received, a chance to prove that his confidence was backed by actual capability. If Sterling truly was the talented professional he claimed to be, he would meet these challenges and emerge stronger. If he wasn't, well, that would become apparent soon enough. My phone buzzed with a text message from Rebecca. "Mom, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. Sterling feels terrible about what he said. He was just trying to be funny and it came out wrong. You know how he is with his jokes." I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I appreciate the apology. These things happen." But as I typed those words, I realized that Rebecca still didn't understand what had actually occurred at the barbecue. She saw it as a poorly executed joke, an awkward moment that could be smoothed over with an apology and a laugh. She had no idea that her husband had revealed something fundamental about his character, something that would have professional consequences regardless of any personal feelings I might have. That afternoon, I was in my office reviewing quarterly projections when Jennifer buzzed my intercom. "Ms. Martinez, there's a situation developing in the sales division. Michael Chen is meeting with Sterling Turner about a performance improvement plan, and apparently it's not going well." I could hear raised voices through the executive floor, even though the sales offices were 2 floors below. "What kind of not going well?" "Sterling is demanding to speak with whoever made this decision." Michael tried to explain that the goals were reasonable and achievable, but Sterling is insisting that someone is targeting him unfairly. I felt a cold smile cross my lips. Tell Michael that I'm available if he needs backup, but I trust his judgment to handle the situation professionally. Of course, Ms. Martinez. An hour later, Michael appeared in my doorway again, this time looking slightly frazzled. How did it go? I asked. Sterling signed the improvement plan, but he wasn't happy about it. He kept insisting that there must be some mistake, that his performance had been exemplary, and that someone was obviously trying to sabotage his career. Did he suggest who might be doing that? Michael hesitated. He mentioned that his father works here, and he seemed to think that might have something to do with it. He asked if Harold Turner had said something to management. I felt my chest tighten. The idea that Sterling would blame his own father for his professional shortcomings was somehow even worse than his original behavior at the barbecue. What did you tell him? I told him that personnel decisions are based solely on performance data, and that family relationships don't factor into our evaluations. I also reminded him that questioning the motives behind legitimate business decisions isn't the best way to start a performance improvement period. Good answer. That evening, I drove home through the same neighborhoods I had traveled for decades, past the same grocery store where I still clipped coupons despite being able to afford anything I wanted, past the same gas station where I still checked prices even though fuel costs were meaningless to me now. When I pulled into my driveway, I noticed Harold Turner standing beside his mailbox next door. We had been neighbors for 12 years, ever since he and his late wife had bought the house when property values were low. He waved tentatively, and I could see the worry in his shoulders. I walked over to the fence that separated our yards. "Good evening, Harold." "Viola," he said quietly. "I owe you an apology for yesterday. Sterling was completely out of line. Harold, you're not responsible for your son's behavior." He looked down at his hands. "I should have told him years ago who you really are. I thought I was being respectful, keeping your business private like you asked. But maybe if he had known." "It wouldn't have mattered," I said gently. "Sterling's problem isn't that he doesn't know who I am. His problem is how he treats people he thinks are beneath him." Harold nodded slowly. "He called me tonight. He's upset about some performance review at work. He thinks someone's got it out for him." "Harold," I said carefully, "what Sterling is going through at work is completely separate from what happened yesterday. The timing is coincidental." Harold looked at me for a long moment, then nodded again. "I understand." As I walked toward my house, I heard Harold call my name softly. I turned back. "Viola?" "Thank you for giving him a chance to prove himself." I didn't respond, but I gave him a small nod before disappearing inside my house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges for Sterling, new opportunities to demonstrate whether his confidence was justified or misplaced. I had set the wheels in motion, but the outcome was entirely up to him. The only question now was whether he was capable of rising to meet reasonable expectations, or whether he would continue to blame everyone else for his own shortcomings. 3 weeks into Sterling's performance improvement plan, I received the call I had been expecting. "Ms. Martinez." Jennifer's voice was tight with concern. "We have a serious problem with the Hartwell Industries account. Sterling Turner made unauthorized promises to their procurement team, and now they're threatening to terminate their contract." I set down my coffee and pulled up the Hartwell file on my computer. They were one of our largest clients, worth $2.8 million annually. The kind of account that required careful handling and senior-level oversight. "What kind of promises?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. According to their purchasing director, Sterling guaranteed a 15% price reduction on their next order and promised delivery terms that our production schedule can't support. He told them he had executive approval for both concessions. My fingers tightened around the phone. Did he have approval? Michael Chen says absolutely not. Sterling never requested approval for any pricing changes or delivery modifications. He apparently made these commitments during a client dinner last Friday. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of a crisis that could have been easily avoided. "Schedule a meeting with Hartwell for this afternoon. I'll handle it personally. And Sterling? Tell Michael to bring him to my office immediately." 20 minutes later, Michael Chen knocked on my door with Sterling trailing behind him. I had been dreading this moment and anticipating it in equal measure. For 3 weeks, I had watched Sterling struggle with his performance goals, making excuses and blaming market conditions rather than adjusting his approach. Now he had crossed a line that made his future at the company untenable. "Please, both of you, have a seat," I said, gesturing to the chairs across from my desk. Sterling looked confused and slightly annoyed, as if this meeting was an inconvenience in his busy schedule. Michael looked like a man preparing to deliver bad news to his best friend. "Sterling," I began, "I understand you made some commitments to Hartwell Industries last Friday that weren't authorized by management." Sterling's posture straightened defensively. "I was building client relationships. Sometimes you have to make executive decisions in the field." "Executive decisions," I repeated slowly. "You promised them a 15% price reduction that would eliminate our profit margin on their account. You guaranteed delivery terms that would require us to delay orders for 3 other major clients. And you told them these concessions had already been approved by senior management. The client was ready to walk," Sterling said, his voice rising slightly. "I saved the account." "No," I said quietly, "you jeopardized it. Hartwell's procurement director called this morning to verify your promises. When they learned that no such approvals existed, they assumed we were trying to deceive them." Sterling blinked, clearly not understanding the gravity of what he had done. "So get the approvals. I'll take responsibility for jumping the gun." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sterling, the approvals aren't possible. The price reduction you promised would put us $12,000 in the red on their account. The delivery schedule you committed to would cost us penalties with other clients." "Then we'll figure something else out," Sterling said dismissively. "This is business. There's always a solution." I had heard enough. "Sterling, you're terminated, effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Sterling's face went completely blank, as if his brain couldn't process what I had just said. "What?" he finally managed. "Your employment with Morrison Industries is terminated. Michael will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings, and security will walk you out." Sterling's confusion transformed into anger so quickly it was almost comical. "You can't fire me. Who the hell do you think you are?" "I'm the CEO of Morrison Industries," I said calmly. "And yes, I can fire you." The color drained from Sterling's face. He looked back and forth between Michael and me, searching for some sign that this was a joke or a misunderstanding. "That's impossible," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the mahogany surface toward him. "Viola Martinez, Chief Executive Officer, Morrison Industries." Sterling picked up the card with trembling fingers, staring at it as if it might change before his eyes. This can't be. "Your father has worked for me for 15 years, I continued. "He's one of our most valued employees. He's also one of the few people who knew my identity and respected my request to keep that information private. But you, at the barbecue, I'm just what, Sterling?" He couldn't finish the sentence. The realization of what he had done, what he had said, was hitting him in waves. I could see the exact moment when he remembered his words from the barbecue. "How does it feel to mop the floors at your husband's company?" "Oh, God," he whispered. Michael cleared his throat. "Sterling, we should go collect your things now." But Sterling wasn't listening. He was staring at me with a mixture of horror and desperate calculation, as if trying to figure out how to undo the past 3 weeks. "Ms. Martinez," he said, his voice taking on a pleading tone I had never heard from him before. "I had no idea. If I had known who you were, I never would have." "Never would have what?" I asked. "Treated me with respect? Done your job professionally? Refrained from making unauthorized commitments to major clients? I can fix this," he said quickly. "The Hartwell situation. I'll call them right now and explain that there was a miscommunication. I'll make it right. Sterling, you've had 3 weeks to improve your performance. Instead, you've spent that time complaining about unfair treatment and questioning management decisions. This isn't about one mistake with one client. This is about a pattern of behavior that makes you unsuitable for a leadership position in this company." I pulled a folder from my desk and opened it, revealing the documentation Michael had been carefully maintaining. 6 missed deadlines in 3 weeks. 2 client complaints about unprofessional behavior. Expenses that exceeded your budget by 38%. And now an unauthorized commitment that could have cost us our second largest client. Sterling's eyes darted over the papers, seeing his failures laid out in black and white. "I've been under a lot of pressure," he said weakly. "Everyone in this company works under pressure, Sterling. The difference is that most of them rise to meet it." I stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. "Michael will explain the terms of your termination and help you with your transition. Your final paycheck will include payment through the end of this week, plus any accrued vacation time." Sterling remained seated, as if standing would make his firing real. "What about my father? Will this affect his job?" For the first time since the meeting began, I felt a flicker of something other than cold professionalism. Harold Turner is an exemplary employee whose personal life has absolutely no bearing on his professional standing. Your actions reflect only on you. Sterling finally stood, his legs unsteady. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "For what I said at the barbecue, for how I've acted, for all of it." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who had thought so little of me that he felt comfortable humiliating me in front of my entire family. "I appreciate the apology, Sterling. I hope this experience teaches you something about treating people with respect, regardless of what position you think they hold." As Michael escorted Sterling toward the door, I added one final thought. "And Sterling? When you explain this to your wife, I suggest you focus on the professional reasons for your termination. The personal aspects of our relationship are between us." After they left, I sat alone in my office, looking out at the city skyline. I felt no satisfaction in what had just occurred. Firing someone was never pleasant, even when it was necessary and justified. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Mom, Sterling just called. He's very upset about something at work. He said he needs to talk to you about Harold's job. What's going on?" I stared at the message, realizing that the hardest part of this entire situation was still ahead of me. Sterling would have to explain to his wife why he had been fired, and in doing so, he would have to reveal truths about both himself and me that would change our family dynamics forever. I typed back a simple response. "We can talk tonight. There are some things you need to know." As I prepared for the most difficult conversation I would ever have with my daughter, I reflected on how we had reached this point. For years, I had hidden my success to avoid complications and jealousy. I had allowed my family to underestimate me because it seemed easier than dealing with their reactions to the truth. But some truths, I was learning, couldn't be hidden forever. And some people, like Sterling, would always reveal their character when they thought no one important was watching. Tonight, my daughter would learn who her mother really was. And tomorrow, I would begin the process of deciding what kind of relationship we could build on a foundation of honesty instead of assumptions. The only question now was whether Rebecca would be able to handle the truth about both her mother and her husband. Rebecca arrived at my house that evening looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. She stood on my front porch clutching her purse like a lifeline, and for a moment, she looked exactly like the little girl who used to run to me when she scraped her knee. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "I don't understand what's happening. Sterling won't tell me anything except that he made a mistake at work, and now he's been fired. He keeps saying he needs to talk to you about Harold's job, but Harold won't even answer his phone." I stepped aside to let her in, my heart breaking at the confusion and pain in her voice. "Sweetheart, come sit down. We need to have a conversation that's long overdue." Rebecca followed me to the living room, the same room where she had done homework at my kitchen table for 12 years, where we had celebrated her high school graduation, where she had told me she was engaged to Sterling. Tonight, it would be the place where everything changed. "Sterling said something about you being his boss," Rebecca continued, settling onto my couch. "But that doesn't make sense. You work at the same company as Harold, doing cleaning or maintenance or something, right?" I sat down across from her, choosing my words carefully. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago. I don't work for Morrison Industries. I own it." Rebecca stared at me blankly, as if I had spoken in a foreign language. What do you mean you own it? I mean, I'm the chief executive officer and majority shareholder of Morrison Industries. I have been for 18 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's mouth opened and closed several times before any words came out. That's impossible, she finally whispered. You live in this house. You drive that old Honda. You clip coupons at the grocery store. I live modestly by choice, I said gently. Rebecca, Morrison Industries generates over $300 million in annual revenue. We employ nearly 1,300 people across 3 states. Harold Turner, Sterling's father, is one of our floor supervisors. Sterling was one of our regional sales managers until this afternoon. Rebecca shook her head vigorously, as if physical motion could make my words untrue. No, that can't be right. Why would you hide something like that from me? I had rehearsed this conversation in my head dozens of times over the years, but now that the moment had arrived, all my carefully planned explanations seemed inadequate. Because I wanted to protect you, I said. And because I wanted to protect myself. Protect me from what? From the complications that come with wealth. From people who might want to be your friend for the wrong reasons. From the pressure of living up to expectations that weren't your own. Rebecca's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching anger. So you just let me believe you were struggling? All those times I worried about you? All those times I felt guilty for not helping you more? You never needed to worry about me financially, I said. But you were building your own life, making your own choices. I didn't want my success to overshadow your independence. Independence? Rebecca's voice rose. Mom, I've felt sorry for you for years. I thought you were barely getting by, working some menial job just to make ends meet. Do you have any idea how that made me feel? I felt tears prick at my eyes, but I forced myself to continue. Rebecca, there's more you need to know. About Sterling. What about Sterling? Her voice was sharp now, defensive. The reason he was fired today wasn't just because he made a mistake. It was because he's been underperforming for months. And today he made an unauthorized commitment to a major client that could have cost us millions of dollars. Rebecca stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. You fired my husband? I fired an employee who was failing to meet basic professional standards. Because of what he said at the barbecue, she accused, whirling around to face me. This is about your feelings getting hurt, isn't it? I had expected this reaction, but it still stung. Rebecca, sit down. Let me show you something. Reluctantly, she returned to the couch. I pulled out a folder I had brought home from the office, containing copies of Sterling's performance reviews, sales reports, and expense accounts. These are your husband's employment records, I said, opening the folder. 6 consecutive quarters of declining sales. Client retention rates 12% below average. Expense reports that show a pattern of inflated charges for personal entertainment disguised as business development. Rebecca glanced at the papers but didn't really look at them. Everyone has bad quarters. The economy has been tough. Rebecca, look at these numbers compared to other managers in his division. I spread out several reports across my coffee table. Everyone else adapted to market conditions. Everyone else found ways to maintain their client relationships and control their expenses. Sterling consistently blamed external factors for problems that were clearly internal. You're being unfair, Rebecca said, but her voice lacked conviction. You're holding him to impossible standards because you're angry about a stupid joke. What Sterling said at the barbecue wasn't a joke, I replied quietly. It was a window into how he really thinks about people he considers beneath him. The way he treats service workers, the way he talks about people in support roles, the way he dismissed your concerns when you wanted to defend me. Rebecca flinched at that last point. I didn't defend you because I was embarrassed, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Embarrassed by what? By the idea that my mother was a cleaning lady, and everyone would judge me for it. Tears were flowing freely now. God, Mom, what kind of person does that make me? I moved to sit beside her on the couch, putting my arm around her shoulders. It makes you human. We all care what people think sometimes. But I should have stood up for you regardless of what job you had, she sobbed. And now I find out that you're incredibly successful, and I've been pitying you for years. I don't know which feels worse. We sat in silence for several minutes while Rebecca cried, and I processed the weight of what I had revealed. Finally, she pulled away and looked at me directly. "What happens now?" she asked. "With Sterling, I mean." "That's between you and him," I said. "But Rebecca, I need you to understand something. The problems in Sterling's career weren't caused by one bad day or one inappropriate comment. They were caused by attitudes and behaviors that have been evident for years." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the man who thought it was acceptable to mock me in front of our entire family is the same man who made unauthorized promises to clients and blamed his supervisors when his performance declined. Character isn't compartmentalized." Rebecca was quiet for a long time, staring at the financial report spread across my coffee table. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and uncertain. "How do I go home and face him? How do I tell him I know the truth?" "That's your choice to make," I said. "But Rebecca, whatever you decide about your marriage, I want you to know that nothing between us has to change. I'm still your mother. I still love you exactly the same way I always have." "Everything has changed," she said, standing up again. "I don't even know who you are anymore. I'm exactly who I've always been. I just happen to own a successful company." Rebecca gathered her purse and headed toward the door. "I need time to think about all of this." "Of course. Take all the time you need." At the door, she paused and turned back to me. "Mom? That night when I was 16 and came home crying because Jenny Matthews said I couldn't afford the class trip to Washington? You worked 3 extra shifts that week to pay for it." "I remember. You didn't need to work those shifts, did you?" "No," I admitted. "But you needed to believe that the trip mattered enough for me to sacrifice for it." "I don't understand you," she said, shaking her head. "I don't understand any of this." After she left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of Sterling's professional failures and my own successful deception. I had told my daughter the truth, but I wasn't sure it had brought us closer together. If anything, it seemed to have opened a chasm between us that might be impossible to bridge. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. Harold Turner's name appeared on the screen. "Hello, Harold. Viola, I'm sorry to bother you at home, but Sterling has been calling me all evening. He's frantic, saying he needs me to talk to you about his job. I told him I couldn't help him, but he won't listen. Harold, your son was terminated for legitimate business reasons that have nothing to do with our personal relationship. I hope you know that." "I do know that," Harold said quietly. "I've seen his work, Viola. I've heard how he talks to people. To be honest, I'm surprised it took this long. I'm sorry this puts you in a difficult position with your family." "Don't apologize for doing your job," Harold replied firmly. "Sterling made his own choices. Now he has to live with the consequences." After hanging up, I walked through my modest house, looking at the life I had built in the shadows of my own success. Tomorrow, I would return to my office and continue running a company that most of my family had never known existed. But tonight, I wondered if the cost of keeping that secret had been worth the peace it was supposed to provide. Because the truth, I was learning, had a way of demanding recognition, regardless of how carefully you tried to hide it. The only question now was whether my daughter would be able to forgive me for the deception, and whether she would be able to see her husband clearly enough to make the right decision about her future. 6 months later, I stood in my office looking out at the spring morning, watching the city come alive below. Morrison Industries had weathered the transition smoothly after Sterling's departure. We had successfully retained the Hartwell account after I personally negotiated a more reasonable arrangement that satisfied both companies. Michael Chen had been promoted to regional director, and the sales division was showing its strongest numbers in 3 years. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Can we have lunch today? I have something to tell you." We had been rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully, like archaeologists reconstructing something precious from scattered fragments. The first few months had been painful, filled with difficult conversations about trust, expectations, and the choices we had both made. But gradually, we had found our way to a new understanding. "Of course," I texted back. "Noon at the Garden Cafe?" "Perfect. See you then." I arrived at the cafe early, choosing a quiet table by the window where we could talk privately. Rebecca appeared a few minutes later, looking healthier and more relaxed than I had seen her in years. Her hair was shorter, framing her face in a way that made her look younger and more confident. "Hi, Mom," she said, leaning down to hug me before taking her seat. "You look wonderful, sweetheart. How are you settling into the new apartment?" Rebecca had moved out of the house she had shared with Sterling 3 months earlier, after their divorce was finalized. It had been an amicable separation, considering the circumstances. Sterling had found work with a smaller company in another state, a fresh start that probably benefited everyone involved. "The apartment is perfect," she said, opening her menu even though we both knew she would order the same chicken salad she always chose. "Close enough to my job that I can walk to work, but far enough from the old neighborhood that I don't run into painful memories on every corner." "And how is the job going?" I asked. Rebecca had taken a position with a nonprofit organization that provided business training to women starting their own companies. It was a significant pay cut from her previous work in marketing, but it gave her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her corporate job. "Actually, that's what I wanted to talk to you about," she said, setting down her menu and looking at me directly. "I have an opportunity, but I need your advice." "I'm listening." "The executive director is retiring next year, and the board has asked me to consider applying for the position. It would mean taking on a lot more responsibility, managing a larger budget, overseeing program development across 4 different cities." I felt a surge of pride at her words. "That sounds like an incredible opportunity. What are your concerns?" Rebecca hesitated, fidgeting with her napkin. "I'm not sure I'm qualified. I've only been there 8 months, and I don't have extensive nonprofit experience. Part of me wonders if they're only considering me because they know who my mother is." "Rebecca, look at me." I waited until she met my eyes. "Do you think I would have built a successful company by hiring unqualified people just because I liked them personally? No, of course not." "Then why would you assume a nonprofit board would operate any differently? These people have a mission they care deeply about. They're not going to risk their organization's future on someone who can't do the job." Rebecca smiled slightly. "When you put it that way, it sounds obvious." "It is obvious. You've always been capable of more than you believed. That was true when you were afraid to try out for student government in high school, and it's true now." The waitress came to take our orders, giving us both a moment to collect our thoughts. When she left, Rebecca leaned forward with a more serious expression. "Mom, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you regret keeping your success secret for so long? If you could do it over again, would you handle things differently?" I considered the question carefully. It was something I had thought about many times over the past 6 months, especially during the difficult period when Rebecca and I were working to rebuild our relationship. "I regret that it hurt you," I said finally. "I regret that it made you feel like you had to protect or pity me, but I don't regret the choice itself." "Why not?" "Because it allowed me to see people as they really were. It showed me who treated others with respect regardless of their perceived status, and who only showed courtesy to people they thought could benefit them." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. "Like Sterling." "Like Sterling," I agreed. "But also like you, in some ways." Rebecca flinched slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean you grew up to be a woman who values character over status, who chose meaningful work over a high salary, who had the courage to end a marriage when you realized it wasn't built on the right foundation. Those choices tell me that despite my mistakes, I somehow managed to raise you with the right values." Tears welled up in Rebecca's eyes. "I was so horrible to you for so many years. I was embarrassed by what I thought was your lack of ambition. I actually told Sterling once that I hoped I inherited Dad's drive instead of settling for less like you did. And now? Now I realize that you had more drive and ambition than anyone I've ever known. You just didn't need to advertise it to feel validated." Our food arrived, but neither of us touched it immediately. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the busy lunch crowd move around us. "Rebecca," I said finally, "I want to tell you something else. Something I should have said months ago." "What's that?" "I'm proud of the woman you've become. Not because of your job or your education or any external achievement, but because of how you handled the most difficult period of your life. You learned some hard truths about both your husband and your mother, and instead of running away or lashing out, you chose to face reality and make changes. It didn't feel brave at the time, Rebecca said softly. It felt terrifying. That's what makes it brave. We finally began eating, and the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Rebecca told me about her volunteer work with a literacy program, about the book club she had joined, about the small garden she was starting on her apartment balcony. Simple things that brought her joy in ways her previous life never had. As we prepared to leave, Rebecca reached across the table and took my hand. "Mom, I want you to know that I understand now why you made the choices you did. And I want you to know that I'm going to apply for that director position. Good. And I'm going to stop worrying about whether people think I'm qualified and start focusing on proving that I am. Even better." Outside the cafe, we hugged goodbye in the warm spring sunshine. As I watched Rebecca walk away, I reflected on how much had changed since that disastrous barbecue 6 months earlier. Harold Turner still worked for Morrison Industries, and we maintained the same professional relationship we had always had. He had been promoted to assistant plant manager, a recognition of his years of dedicated service that had nothing to do with family politics. He and I occasionally waved to each other over our shared fence, but we both understood that some subjects were better left undiscussed. Sterling had left town quietly, taking a position with a smaller manufacturing company in Ohio. Rebecca had told me that he was doing well, working hard to rebuild his reputation and his confidence. I hoped he had learned something from his experience, though I suspected he would always blame external circumstances for his failures rather than examining his own behavior. Rebecca and I had dinner together once a week now, sometimes at restaurants, sometimes at my house, occasionally at her new apartment. We talked about books and politics and her work, but we also talked about the years when our relationship had been strained by misunderstandings and unspoken assumptions. We were building something new on a foundation of honesty, and it felt stronger than anything we had shared before. That evening, I sat in my living room with a glass of wine, reading applications for a scholarship program Morrison Industries sponsored for children of employees who wanted to attend college. It was satisfying work, helping young people build futures that might be limited only by their own ambitions rather than their family's financial circumstances. My phone rang, and I was surprised to see Rebecca's name on the screen. "Hi, sweetheart. How was the rest of your day?" "Mom, I submitted my application for the director position. How do you feel?" "Terrified and excited in equal measure." I laughed. "That sounds about right. When will you hear back?" 3 weeks. "But Mom, regardless of what happens, I want you to know that I learned something important today." "What's that?" "I learned that the best inheritance you can give someone isn't money or property or even opportunities. It's the confidence to believe they deserve good things and the strength to work for them." After we hung up, I walked through my modest house, past the same furniture I had owned for decades, past the same family photos that had been gathering dust for years. Nothing about my physical surroundings had changed, but everything felt different. For the first time in my adult life, I was living authentically. My family knew who I was. My employees respected my leadership, and my company continued to thrive under transparent management. I had spent so many years hiding my success that I had forgotten the simple pleasure of being known and appreciated for my real achievements. The cost of that deception had been high. It had damaged my relationship with my daughter, and allowed people like Sterling to reveal their true character in ways that hurt everyone involved. But it had also taught me valuable lessons about the difference between respect and fear, between genuine admiration and calculated flattery. Tomorrow, I would return to my office and continue building something meaningful. I would make decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars in revenue. I would solve problems and create opportunities and lead with the same quiet confidence that had carried me from a night shift cleaning job to the executive suite. But tonight, I was simply a woman who had raised a daughter with integrity, maintained her principles under pressure, and learned that some truths are worth revealing regardless of the complications they bring. Some foundations, I had discovered, could only be built on solid ground. And solid ground, it turned out, was made of honesty, respect, and the courage to be exactly who you were, regardless of who was watching. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.